3:47 a.m., Tuesday. A trembling voice on the emergency line. "He's not breathing. There's blood." By sunrise, a mansion that sold the illusion of safety is sealed with crime scene tape. Days earlier, the husband discovered his wife's secret relationship. Now, the timeline matters. We'll stick to verifiable facts, minute marks, movements, money. No sensationalism. Just what the camera saw, what the ledgers recorded, and what the evidence says happened in the 14 minutes that turned a private ultimatum into a homicide.
On paper, the household at Condone looked frictionless. A 50-year-old real estate magnate with charity plaques on every wall, a wife with a nursing background and a portfolio of community projects, and a staff roster that ran like an airport schedule. The villa was more campus than home. Private chapel, glass-walled study, winter garden, and a garage workshop curated like a museum. Visitors left with the same impression. Wealth made orderly, grief made productive, a family that had figured out how to live under scrutiny. Security cameras tracked entrances and corridors, not as paranoia, the family said, but as prudence in a region where visibility equals risk. If you accepted that premise, everything else looked reasonable.
Inside that premise were systems that blurred into control. Cameras expanded from gates to hallways, then from hallways to common rooms, then into spaces a guest would consider private. The assistant compiled daily digests, who met whom, how long, which cards were used where. It read like a logistics report until you noticed the tone, behavioral adjectives, not just times and totals. The line between safety and surveillance is thin when one person owns the house, the servers, and the narrative. In that house, the line kept moving. The wife's file, from public sources, presented a different energy. Hospital shifts in another country turned into health outreach plans that never quite launched after marriage. Her calendar, once crowded with grant calls and training modules, thinned into charity luncheons and ceremonial visits. You could chart that change without speculating about motives. Just compare message volume, meeting invites, and travel approvals before and after the move. Distance from friends grew measurable in unanswered threads and postponed reunions. Isolation rarely appears in a single dramatic entry. It accrues like dust. Staffing records placed a young American house employee in the wife's orbit months before the wedding. Her duties were unremarkable on paper: bedroom wing, office, winter garden, personal effects. Proximity, not title, mattered. Hours logged in the private block, keys that opened rooms others only cleaned in teams. Early notes from supervisors framed it as efficiency. One trusted hand, fewer disruptions. Over time, the annotation shifted from operational to cultural, flagging language use and boundaries that feel informal. In households built on hierarchy, informality can read as defiance. Money left clearer tracks than conversation. Transfers labeled as bonuses for education support began small and plausible. They scaled into jewelry purchases coded as staff recognition and, eventually, a lease for an off-site apartment funded from personal accounts. Each transaction carried a story that could be true in isolation. Patterns, however, do not live in isolation. They live in cadence and escalation. The cadence here was weekly, then near daily, then time-to-travel windows. If you only follow receipts, you can reconstruct intent without reading a single text. The public image of the husband was steady: donor walls, think tank panels, a pivot from traditional investments to future-proof assets. Colleagues praised his composure and called him principled in negotiation, a man who changed course only after gathering more data than anyone else at the table. That discipline translated at home into routines that looked virtuous until they looked rigid. Prayer at set times, study at set times, meetings that never bent to domestic demands. In the space left behind, other people filled needs they were hired to anticipate. Predictability is efficient. It is also easy to map. The technology footprint of the house told its own story. New camera serials appeared on the network after a stated period of regional tension, which made sense, then stayed after the tension passed, which made sense only if the threat narrative remained useful. Mic channels in common rooms were active by default. Private rooms required consent that could be toggled by someone with administrative access. Logs showed those toggles moving more often near the wife's office. A reader can guess why. An investigator simply timestamps the change and asks who had credentials. Friends describe the wife as capable, gentle with patience, and resistant to theatrics. Their messages to her shifted over a year from celebratory to careful, shorter, less specific, calibrated for an audience that might not be friendly. She rarely replied in real time, citing time zones and obligations. When she did, she wrote around the edges of things: weather, food, shows that reminded her of home. Normal life leaves detail. The absence of mundane detail is its own data point. People who feel watched speak in safe nouns. Within the staff, expectations traveled faster than directives. Reports to the family elder reframed companionship as impropriety and privacy as secrecy. English shared between two Americans sounded exclusionary in a wing where deference was a language. The staffer adapted first. Shorter pauses, more doors left ajar, tasks completed in clusters to reduce unsupervised minutes. The wife adapted later. Fewer requests, more thanks by note, meetings during hours with the most foot traffic. Adaptation is survival. It also signals pressure. Even the architecture participated. The winter garden was designed for serenity. Filtered light, controlled air, pools that looked still even when filters hummed. It became the one place where two people could share a bench and not look like they were sharing anything at all. Camera coverage in that space prioritized entrances and exits over benches and railings, a choice justified by privacy policy and exploited by anyone who knew how lenses were angled. Every house teaches its inhabitants where sound carries and where it doesn't. This one did too. Nothing in this chapter proves a crime. It establishes context. A home optimized for control, a marriage managed like an enterprise, a friendship growing in the gaps between policy and need. It sets variables: money movement, access, surveillance, isolation, whose interactions would later become central to every timeline. In cases like this, the first truth is simple: appearances are systems. When systems shift, outcomes do not change by accident, they change by design. The earliest reliable signal is financial because money does not editorialize. Account logs show the first transfer labeled education support leaving the wife's personal card on the 15th of the month, a modest sum that fits a bonus narrative. The destination belongs to the staffer and matches payroll records, which makes the gesture plausible. Over the next 6 weeks, the cadence tightens and the amounts grow, shifting from incidental to structured. Each explanation, tuition, family medical bills, relocation costs, could be true on its own. Patterns, however, are measured in repetition rather than story. Jewelry purchases appear next, coded as staff recognition and invoiced to a boutique that often supplies diplomatic gifts. The receipts list generic descriptions, but the serials trace to pieces photographed later on an account that investigators attribute to the staffer's alternate profile. The wife's card covers the transactions in full with no reimbursement from household budgets. That bypass matters because legitimate staff awards in this household typically route through the family office. The deviation is small, but small deviations accumulate into direction. A lease surfaces for a waterfront apartment 30 minutes from the villa, registered in the staffer's name and funded by transfers from the wife's private account. The property advertises discreet access, secure parking, and lifts that open directly into units. The lease begins the same week the staffer's shifts change from team-based to solo in the private wing. Delivery logs show grocery and parcel services arriving at irregular hours consistent with intermittent occupancy. None of this is criminal. All of it is useful to a timeline. Phone records add texture without revealing content.
Calls between the two women cluster around late evenings when the husband was known to be in executive sessions, and around mid-afternoons when the winter garden was typically empty. The average call length grows from 3 minutes to 14 across a quarter, which suggests deepening reliance. Messaging metadata shows bursts that align with travel windows and charity events, periods when visibility provided cover. Investigators cannot quote what was said, they can only map when it mattered. Inside the house, technology choices evolve in ways that look like policy but read like focus. New cameras come online in corridors that bracket the wife's suite, and microphone channels toggle more frequently near her office. Network logs confirm administrator activity during hours attributable to the security team, though credentials were shared across shifts. A single device identifier linked to the husband appears repeatedly in archives viewers for common area footage, often in the same hour blocks late at night. Viewed generously, it is diligence. Viewed narrowly, it is fixation. Staff notes begin to reflect culture rather than chores. Supervisors document language drift toward English in the private wing and informal boundaries in conversation length. They frame these as operational risks because hierarchy depends on distance. The staffer adjusts her routines, doors left open, tasks grouped to minimize unsupervised time, route choices that keep her in view of known lenses. The wife adjusts differently. Requests move to written form, thanks delivered by note, meetings scheduled during peak foot traffic. Adaptation is a signal that someone feels observed. Financial forensics widen beyond transfers and into categorization. The wife's personal spending splits into two tracks: public-facing philanthropy expenses and private disbursements that avoid the family office. The latter rarely exceed thresholds that would trigger automated reviews, suggesting awareness of compliance gates. Several payments label shell vendors that, when resolved, lead back to service accounts controlled by the staffer. The sums are not large enough to alarm a billionaire's auditors. They are large enough to fund privacy. Public behavior keeps pace with private adjustments. The wife maintains attendance at charity luncheons and health board meetings, settings with reliable witness pools and dense camera coverage. Her arrivals and departures are punctual, her interactions ordinary, her calendar visible to people outside the house. That visibility functions as a reputational shield and an incidental alibi, whether or not she intended it that way. People living under scrutiny often lean into routine because routine is defensible. Routine also creates windows. Meanwhile, the husband's networks constrict. Colleagues describe a man increasingly protective of brand and legacy, moving key decisions closer to family oversight. Meetings lengthen, calls stack late, and travel compresses into sprints that leave the house quiet in his absence. His assistants escalate information hygiene, asking for summaries of conversations and consolidating vendor access. In organizations, language about hygiene often masks language about control. At home, the mask is thinner. The apartment becomes a gravitational point in the data. Building access logs register entries tied to the staffer's key fob on afternoons that correlate with the wife's charity commitments. Ride-hail receipts link the addresses in both directions, always booked under the staffer's account and paid with a card funded by the wife. Camera footage from lobbies shows two arrivals spaced minutes apart, never side by side, a choreography that suggests intent to avoid joint capture. There is no audio, and none is needed to understand the effort made to leave no single image of two people together. By the end of the quarter, the red flags are not singular or dramatic, they are cumulative. Money moves in stepping stones rather than leaps. Access expands where eyes can be managed. Communications cluster when watchful schedules create gaps. The house tightens its systems under the banner of safety, and those living inside learn the angles where a lens does not land. This chapter is not an accusation, it is a ledger. It records how proximity hardens into attachment, and how attachment prints itself on minutes and money long before anyone utters a word.
The turning point presented itself as paperwork, not as drama. After weeks of private review, a hired risk consultant delivered a folder that reorganized suspicions into exhibits, transfers, leases, overlapping travel windows. What happened inside the study after that delivery is filtered through competing accounts, but the sequence that followed is clear enough to plot. A household that already lived by schedules acquired a different kind of countdown. Conversations shortened, doors closed more firmly, and the staff logged smaller mistakes than usual, which is how worry often surfaces in places built to hide it. Planning rarely begins with a speech, it begins with a clock. Phone records show the wife's circle tightening to a few numbers she trusted before the marriage flattened her social map. One of those numbers belonged to a cousin in another country, a man with a service record and a problem set that included debt, insomnia, and pride. The first call lands late on a weekday with the tone of a person asking for counsel. The next calls lengthen, shift to hours when the house sleeps, and include repeats after missed connections that suggest urgency rather than habit. Investigators cannot assign motives to the cousin from metadata, but they can show the curve. Curiosity to involvement is a slope measured in minutes. In parallel, the house changed its posture under the banner of prudence. Security added eyes where daylight faltered, and microphones in common rooms flipped from passive to active for a temporary period. Logs show an administrator account checking feeds at increasingly regular intervals, clustering around nights when the husband worked alone. The wife altered her movements within that net, more visible during high traffic hours, more written requests, fewer spontaneous walks. People do not fight systems head-on when the system can outlast them. They learn the blind angles.
Money, again, acts as a schematic for intent. A second tier of payments appears, smaller and more numerous, routed through shell vendors that resolve to service accounts already tied to the staffer. None exceeds internal review thresholds, which suggests an understanding of what triggers human attention inside automated compliance. Each payment carries a label that looks like maintenance if you glance and coordination if you stare. The pattern lands between those modes long enough to seem harmless until it isn't. Budgets do not confess, but they do narrate.
Travel also begins to speak. Searches on one device include accommodations within walking distance of the villa's least monitored gate, operating hours for late-night coffee shops that do not ask questions, and ride-hail routes that avoid arterial cameras. Another device looks up public transit maps for a different city where the cousin lives, then pivots to flight aggregators that emphasize flexible fares. None of that proves what anyone intended to do, and the report says so. Still, movement planning tends to look like this when people are building options they do not plan to explain later. Inside the staff logs, phrasing shifts from task compliance to tone. Supervisors record strained cordiality at briefings and note that the wife's voice stays low even when refusing. That is a detail from an overtrained ear, which makes it credible. The staffer reduces time in the private wing by small increments without missing deliverables, an adjustment that lowers exposure while appearing diligent. The household assistant, meanwhile, asks the security office for more frequent summaries of who entered which corridor. Courtesy can be a wrapper for surveillance. The inverse is also true. Network behavior suggests rehearsal. Microphone channels in 2 rooms near the study are toggled off for maintenance checks on 3 separate days, each just long enough to test a silence window. The same week, interior lights in the west corridor run a diagnostic twice after midnight, creating 30-second pockets of shadow between motion triggers. On their own, these are routine tasks. In sequence, they are a map of where sensors blink. An investigator does not need to speculate about why a person might want darkness if the timeline shows when they tried it. The cousin's travel appears ordinary on a manifest, a tourist ticket, a hotel reservation paid by card, a return date that would not raise eyebrows. The hotel inventory shows a room choice positioned between elevators and stairs, a preference common to light sleepers and people who plan to move without being noticed.
Receipts include meals eaten on site, which builds a paper alibi, and electronics purchased with cash, which erases one. A concierge remembers the guest asking about the nearest laundromat, then never using it. Small talk becomes a data point when everything else is documented. Alibi scaffolding takes shape around public calendars. The wife accepts a charity commitment with a fixed agenda and multiple witnesses, a setting where attendance can be proven by cameras not her own. She confirms future meetings she cannot possibly keep if the worst happens, the behavior of someone signaling normalcy to an audience that can vouch later. Her messages to family stick to safe topics that require no context to parse. In situations like these, routine is not comfort, it is cover. It is also a trap if the routine does not bend at the right times. At the villa, physical space is tuned like an instrument. Doors that usually latch are left on their first catch during cleaning rounds, which saves seconds and leaves no visible trace. A service entrance that staff use during shift changes shows one irregular entry in a week, otherwise symmetrical. The winter garden side gate, ordinarily secured at dusk, is logged as checked rather than locked twice in 10 days. None of these choices break a rule, they interpret it. Architecture does not commit crimes, but it can be taught to cooperate. By the close of this chapter, intent is still a legal word nobody has said out loud. What exists are preparations that can be explained one way if life continues and another way if it doesn't. A cousin whose skills were once for defense is now in the same city as a family dispute that escalated. A house designed to record everything has demonstrated where it blinks if you push the right buttons. A calendar that claimed visibility has quietly carved a window of plausible absence. Planning does not announce itself. It accumulates until the path of least resistance points in only one direction. At 11:12 p.m., the East Corridor camera records the wife leaving the kitchen with a silver tray, its reflection briefly flaring against the lens. 3 minutes later, at 11:15, the study camera shows her crossing the threshold with tea and honey, an ordinary ritual in a house that treated ritual as order. The husband is seated behind the glass-topped desk, papers squared, pen aligned to the edge, posture that reads as end-of-day focus. The microphone channel that usually pairs with this view is dark, flagged earlier for maintenance, which removes the only tool that would have captured tone. Without audio, investigators rely on placement, motion, and the physics of what gets knocked over when people stop agreeing. Initial movements are calm enough to clock. She sets the tray down, slides the cup toward him, and takes the chair opposite, feet planted, hands visible. He glances at a page, then up at her, then back to the page, a pattern that suggests he expects a conversation about logistics rather than rupture. 39 seconds pass in near stillness before both lean forward at once, her toward words, him toward the desk's edge. The first non-ordinary object displacement is small, spoon rotated, paper corner askew, but small displacements accumulate like tremors before a break. If this was an argument, it has not yet become one. If it was a decision, it is already underway. The pivot from ritual to incident occurs at 11:19:47. The tray shifts abruptly, the cup tips, and a crescent of tea fans across the contracts, mapping impact more than intent. The husband rises fast, chair legs skidding, and circles the desk, a path that brings him into camera center. The wife stands slower, shoulders set, hands below the frame for a beat too long to decode. In the next second, both are in proximity at the desk corner where the tray now hangs off balance. Accidental collisions look different from practiced edges. This edge is sharp. There is no audio of the first contact, only a change in posture that investigators read as an attempted restraint followed by recoil. The husband's hand closes around the wife's wrist, then releases when she twists away, her shoulder knocking the tray to the floor. The second contact is not restraint, it is impact. His arm moves across the vertical plane of her face, and her body falls out of frame as if the floor found her faster than she expected. The absence of sound here matters. What we know is position, timing, and the fact that objects stop where force sends them. The critical blow happens in the blur that follows, at 11:20:11. The wife rises with something heavy in her right hand, shape consistent with the silver teapot now missing from the tray debris. The arc is short and downward, the kind that trades wind-up for proximity. The husband's head snaps to the side, he staggers backward into the desk, shoulder catching the edge, knees buckling. He does not fall all the way, he sits hard against the credenza, hands searching for purchase that a slick glass top does not provide. Medical analysis later describes a cranial injury survivable with immediate aid. What the video shows next is time, not assistance. At 11:21, the wife steadies herself on the desk and looks at her hands as if checking for proof of what has just happened. At 11:22, she steps toward the doorway, pauses, and steps back, eyes on the husband's face, then the floor, then the scattered papers. At 11:23, she retrieves a phone from her pocket and dials, screen glow reflecting off the glass. The call lasts less than 20 seconds. Metadata tags it to a number later linked to the cousin's hotel room. When she ends the call, she does not leave the room. The husband remains conscious through 11:27. He shifts to his side, then tries to rise, balance refusing him in motions that read as vestibular insult. His lips move as if speaking, but the camera cannot hear, and no other device was recording. At 11:29, he reaches for the desk with his left hand and misses by inches, fingers skidding on paper he had squared earlier that night. The wife watches from near the door, weight shifting heel to toe like someone deciding between exits. Decision, in this sequence, is not an instant, it is a posture held too long. The cousin's arrival window opens at 12:34 a.m., captured by a service entrance camera that sits lower than the others and shows feet before faces. He wears a cap, carries a small duffel, and moves with the practiced economy of a person for whom corridors are maps. The interior alarm does not chirp. Logs later show the entrance marked as checked rather than armed during the last shift change. In houses like this, routines are safety. A single softened step in routine is a door that opens quieter than usual. He does not hesitate at intersections, because people who rehearse rarely do. Staging begins where the scene first broke. At 12:38, the cousin and the wife reposition the husband's body into the study chair, torso squared to the desk, chin slightly forward, a tableau of late-night collapse. The floor is wiped where the tray fell. Papers are restacked with an order that edges into the unnatural. A pen is placed precisely parallel to the desk edge, a detail that would look neat to anyone who has never seen a real emergency. The camera catches a cloth passing over the glass once, twice, 3 times, long enough to clean away prints and context. The missing object becomes absence rather than evidence through method. At 12:56, the cousin carries the empty tray out of frame, and the garage camera picks him up 4 minutes later, entering the workshop, lights blooming to full after a motion-triggered delay. He spends 19 minutes out of sight of that lens, during which the ventilation hood cycles on and off in a pattern that suggests heat applied and dispersed. Metal leaves residue where air carries it. Later, microscopic particles on the hood filters match the family silver's alloy. A teapot is an heirloom until it is a shape. A shape is evidence until it is mass. Money moves while the air still smells like solvent. Between 1:20 and 1:42, transfers leave the husband's personal accounts in amounts just below manual review flags, routed through vendors already mapped in earlier quarters. The device used is one the husband normally kept at his desk. The credentials autofill the way they do when a system decides convenience matters more than doubt. Each transfer has a memo line that reads like routine business to anyone not trained to see rhythm. In aggregate, rhythm is motive set to numbers. The last hour before the call is quiet in a way that never reads as peace on video. The wife sits on the study sofa with her hands folded. The cousin stands once in the doorway, then is gone down the corridor to the service exit, feet again before face, then nothing. At 3:07, the wife walks to the bathroom, splashes water, and returns with a towel she presses to her cheek where earlier contact bloomed into a red mark. At 3:26, she rearranges the husband's tie by 2 fingers' width, small enough to seem loving, large enough to look placed. At 3:47, she dials the emergency number and says the sentence dispatchers hear too often: "He's not breathing."
What this chapter provides is not motive, it is sequence. It shows ritual deployed as cover, a microphone silenced for maintenance, an argument that may have been a monologue depending on who was listening, and a blow that created a window for 2 kinds of choice: help or narrative. The choices visible on camera favor narrative. The 14 minutes between injury and non-responsiveness are not filled with aid. They are filled with waiting, fetch, wipe, place. The distinction matters because timelines are not opinions. They are maps people either follow toward rescue or away from it. First responders arrived to a scene that looked composed rather than interrupted. The body sat upright at the desk, the pen aligned perfectly, and papers squared in neat stacks no cardiac emergency ever leaves behind. Paramedics noted cool skin at the temples and a faint contusion near the ear that did not fit a simple collapse. They recorded both details and moved the case from medical to police within minutes. The wife's account was consistent in phrasing but light on sequence, a pattern trained dispatchers recognize as rehearsed. The household supervisor recited a timeline that matched no one else's watch. When a story lands fully formed at 3 in the morning, experienced detectives start with what the room says instead. The lead investigator, Octavia Pierce, requested a limited hold on the house, not a full lockdown, which preserved staff cooperation without triggering the kind of legal fight that wealthy families prepare for. She walked the study once without touching anything, and then again counting steps, measuring where a person would stand to see the corridor camera light but not the lens. Her field notes flagged the over-clean glass, the lack of smear arcs near the chair, and a tea-stain fan across paper that radiated from an unusual angle. She asked for the tea service. The tray appeared without a pot. "Missing is not the same as stolen," she wrote, "because stolen leaves a gap in an inventory. Missing leaves a question in a story. That distinction would organize the next 48 hours. Preliminary medical findings shifted the frame from tragedy to crime before dawn. The examiner documented a focal head injury consistent with a blunt object, noting subgaleal swelling and a pattern that suggested a short arc rather than a fall from height. No defensive wounds appeared on the hands, which argued against a sustained struggle. Toxicology screens ordered on intake were clean for sedatives and alcohol, removing one common explanation for late-night collapse. Time of death estimates, anchored to core temperature and lividity, narrowed the window to just before midnight. In investigations where narrative tries to expand the night, biology reminds everyone how short it really was. Digital retrieval began where nearly every modern case lives, in the building's own memory. Security servers yielded corridor feeds and access logs, but the study's microphone channel had been disabled that evening for maintenance, a coincidence too neat to accept without corroboration. Pierce requested maintenance tickets and found 3 recent tests in nearby rooms that ended seconds before and after the blackout, suggesting a rehearsal rather than a failure. Administrator access had toggled those channels from a terminal in the security office. 2 guards shared the credential. "When everyone owns the key, no one does," she told her team, and then asked who benefits from silence more than from sound. The money trail, already visible in earlier quarters, now became a spine for interviews. Forensic accountants mapped personal transfers from the wife's accounts to service vendors that resolved to the staffer's control, careful to mark where amounts sat just under internal review thresholds. A second pattern emerged from the husband's devices: post-midnight disbursements to offshore entities labeled as routine payables, all executed on a workstation in the study after the estimated injury time.
Autocomplete and saved credentials made the transactions easy to send and easier to misread. Machines will not tell you who pressed the key. They will tell you which key was pressable at speed. Pierce circled the timestamps and wrote, "This is narrative in numbers." Interviews with staff were conducted in the driver's lounge, neutral ground away from cameras and family ears. Individually, accounts felt tidy. Collectively, they frayed at the edges where rehearsals often do. 2 housekeepers placed the wife in her suite by 11:30 and also remembered hearing glass contact tile in the study at the same minute, a spatial impossibility in that floor plan. A junior guard admitted he logged the West service door as checked rather than armed at shift change because, quote, "it saves time and no one uses it, a habit the logs confirmed twice that week." Small conveniences, Pierce reminded them, are how doors open for people who do not want to be announced. Device forensics added motion to still frames. The wife's phone showed a call at 11:23 to a number traced to a hotel room registered to her cousin, followed by a flurry of deleted messages the software could timeline even if it could not recover. The cousin's device, when later obtained, contained cached maps of the neighborhood with a pin dropped on a coffee shop that stayed open past midnight, 2 blocks from the service entrance. Hotel access logs placed him in his room for room service delivery near 10 and back again after 1. The gap matched the service camera sighting at 12:34. Alibis that rely on buildings forget that buildings keep better diaries than people do. When detectives reached the garage workshop, the air still held a thin metallic tang. The ventilation hood's smart controller recorded airflow cycles between 12:58 and 1:17, a window that aligned with the cousin's absence from the hotel and the wife's sit-still posture in the study. Swabs from the hood filter later revealed alloy particulates consistent with the family silver, a finding notable because silverware sheds mostly at edges, not in powder that rides exhaust. On a shelf, an abrasive wheel showed fresh wear, not matched by any logged maintenance task. The absence of a teapot in the kitchen had become a presence in the air ducts. Cooperation requests to foreign partners moved on 2 tracks, one quiet and one fast. Quietly, Pierce sent bank identifiers to a liaison who could see through layers of shell registrations in friendly jurisdictions, watching for accounts seeded in the hours after death. The fast track targeted the staffer rumored to have left the country, exit records, flight manifests, and employment checks in a city where her family lived. Local officers there found her working under her legal name with a false employment history. The mismatch was enough for a voluntary interview. People who have been running from shame, Pierce knew, sometimes run toward the first person who asks for the truth without shouting. The interview with the staffer did not break so much as bend. She began with professionalism and ended with a timeline that matched cameras more than loyalties. She described maintenance tests on microphones, doors left on first catch because it's faster, and a winter garden where conversation felt safe because lenses faced entrances, not benches. She did not describe violence, she described fear, and fear explains preparation even when it does not excuse what followed. Offered counsel, she asked whether telling the whole sequence would matter if the outcome could not change. For investigators, sequence always matters because it is the only part that can be proven. Back at the villa, Pierce's team reconstructed the study with tape outlines and measured angles. They recreated the tea spill with identical cups and documented how liquid travels across glass when knocked from a tray versus swept from a desk. The pattern on the original papers favored impact from the tray's height. They measured distances a person would cover moving from the desk corner to the doorway in the seconds visible on camera, and how long it takes to choose to dial or not dial when a man cannot stand. They compared natural emergency disarray to the meticulous still life the room presented at 3 in the morning. The study felt like a showroom, one detective said, and showrooms are arranged for viewers, not for living. By the end of 48 hours, the case file had replaced conjecture with layered evidence, biology that narrowed time, video that mapped position,
air that carried metal where metal should not be, and money that moved in rhythm with opportunity. The wife's statement remained technically consistent and materially incomplete, a combination courts read as control rather than candor. The cousin's manifest told one story, his feet told another on the service camera feed. And the house itself, designed to see everything, had quietly testified about where it blinked and when. Investigations that refuse easy stories do not do so for elegance. They do it because the hard story is the only one the facts can carry.
With that foundation, legal steps followed the logic of the timeline. Preservation orders locked down remaining servers and personal devices. Targeted warrants sought the cousin's bags and the staffer's alternate accounts. A limited detention was requested for the wife to prevent evidence interference while counsel assembled. None of those actions answered why. They answered who, when, and how, the questions that hold when motive is still contested. In rooms like these, Pierce tells new detectives, we do not guess at hearts. We prove hands, we prove minutes, and we let the minutes say what people will not. The indictment read like a timeline written in legal verbs. Prosecutors charged the wife with intentional homicide and conspiracy, the cousin with accessory and laundering counts, and the staffer with conspiracy contingent on extradition. Arraignments were brief because the evidence inventory was not. Video segments, server logs, alloy particulates, banking cadences, and travel manifests that mapped a night, hour by hour. Defense teams entered pleas of not guilty and asked for staggered discovery to separate narratives they said were being unfairly braided. The court allowed a phased schedule, but consolidated key hearings to avoid contradictory rulings on the same technical questions. From the outset, the case was less about what happened than about how much of it could be proved without a single recorded word. Jury selection lasted longer than anyone predicted for a trial without headline confession. Counsel questioned prospective jurors about surveillance, domestic control, and how they interpret silence in a marriage. Several were dismissed for saying that video without audio is half a truth, a phrase both sides disliked for opposite reasons. The panel that remained skewed toward people who manage process for a living. Auditors, engineers, nurses, and a logistics manager who said timelines are how you respect reality. The judge approved them with a reminder that sympathy is not a standard of proof. Everyone took notes on that sentence because it forecast how the evidence would be weighed. The prosecution opened without adjectives, a choice that seemed deliberate given the case's potential to inflame. They played the corridor feeds first to set geography, then the study footage in unbroken sequence to establish duration and choice. A forensic pathologist explained the injury and the window for survivability with treatment, careful to say what could not be inferred. A digital forensics expert traced microphone toggles and maintenance tickets, highlighting how repeated tests bracketed the blackout. The money analyst finished the day with a slide that turned transfers into a metronome, the kind of visualization jurors who live by schedules immediately understand. Defense counsel countered by reframing the same images as the aftermath of coercion and fear. They argued that control inside the marriage rose to a level that distorted judgment and narrowed options, making bad decisions tragic rather than criminal. A clinical psychologist testified about the ways surveillance and isolation corrode agency, offering a framework for why a person might freeze or seek help from family before dialing emergency services. Cross-examination elicited the concession that such dynamics describe tendencies, not certainties, and cannot substitute for the acts the camera recorded. The wife's attorneys pressed the point that intent cannot be read from posture, and that absence of aid is not proof of homicidal purpose. The judge sustained several objections to rhetorical questions that sounded more like summations than queries. The cousin's role was litigated through objects that could not testify but could be measured. Receipts, lint, and a hotel key card walked the jury through his night one mundane step at a time. The workshop ventilation logs became a proxy witness, and the alloy finding on the hood filter landed harder than expected because it felt apolitical and precise. His lawyer argued that hands accustomed to repairing things in service of a family could be misread when the family is in crisis. The prosecution replied that repair cleans, and cleaning after blood is not repair. The distinction stayed with the panel because it relied on verbs, not values. When the staffer appeared by video link from another jurisdiction, the courtroom quieted in a way that rooms do when a person who holds connective tissue begins to speak. She described routine as an architecture of pressure, doors latched to save seconds, and microphones tested in patterns that later matched the blackout. Her account avoided conclusions about motive and stayed close to the observable, which made it more credible. She admitted to accepting money, explained it as support for debts and tuition, and acknowledged the apartment as a place to breathe outside the house's logic. Defense counsel thanked her for avoiding speculation. The prosecutor thanked her for timestamps. The jury thanked her by writing more notes in that hour than in any other. The wife chose to testify, a risk calculated to replace speculation with a voice the jurors could judge directly. She spoke quietly about control and humiliation and the fear of public ruin, framing the night as a collision between love, pride, and the refusal to be erased. Under direct examination, she described the blow as reflex after a strike and her failure to call for help as shock. Under cross, the timeline asserted itself. The call at 11:23 to the cousin, the minutes counted on screen without any attempted aid. The staged desk, the tie adjusted by 2 fingers' width. She answered that she wished she had chosen differently, and that at the time she felt trapped by threats. The jury saw a person. The record saw a schedule. Closing arguments, minutes, and means. The prosecution asked the panel to trust sequences over stories and to treat the staged room as a statement of consciousness rather than panic. They stressed that motive is not required when action and preparation are proven by independent systems that do not conspire. Defense counsel urged the panel to see a battered will rather than a plotted murder, to consider how coercive environments compress moral space until wrong choices seem like the only choices available. They conceded negligence and even culpability short of intent, but rejected the architecture of premeditation the state described. The judge's instructions emphasized the difference between reasonable doubt and speculative doubt, and between sympathy and standard. Deliberations took 3 days and produced questions that revealed where the panel labored. They asked to replay the study footage without interruption, and then again with a clock overlay. They requested a readback of the pathologist's estimate on survivability and the network log explanation of microphone toggles. They wanted to see the workshop ventilation chart side by side with the cousin's hotel access logs. Those requests mapped the shape of their doubt, not whether harm occurred, but whether the line between panicked cover and planned concealment had been crossed. When they returned, their verdicts followed the evidence's cadence rather than any witness's rhetoric. The wife was found guilty of intentional homicide and conspiracy, with the jury foreperson later saying that the 14-minute gap and the staging elements erased reasonable doubt about intent. The cousin was found guilty of accessory after the fact and laundering counts, the panel distinguishing between his absence from the blow and his presence in the cleanup. The staffer's verdict was entered in absentia on the conspiracy count, pending resolution of jurisdictional and extradition issues beyond the jury's reach. Sentencing arguments featured victim impact statements that were notable for their restraint and a pre-sentence report that balanced lack of prior record against leadership in a complex offense. The judge explained each term with reference to minutes, not headlines. In allocution, the wife said she regretted the path that made violence thinkable, and that she still feared the ruin public exposure would have brought to people she loved. The court noted that fear does not negate agency when alternatives, however costly, exist within the law. The cousin apologized without conditions and asked that the record reflect his service and his injury as context, not excuse. The judge credited remorse and imposed a term that left a path back to civilian life after significant custody. For the staffer, counsel argued for any eventual sentence to consider cooperation and the absence of direct violence, a question deferred to future proceedings. Appeals followed predictably on narrow issues: admissibility of maintenance logs without direct testimony from the technician, the scope of the digital warrants, and whether the alloy finding required a more rigorous chain of custody instruction. An appellate panel upheld the convictions, reasoning that each challenged piece was cumulative to a record already strong on time, position, and action. They wrote that the case did not rest on a single keystone, but on a trestle of independent supports. In practical terms, that meant the verdicts did not rise or fall on any one expert, a design prosecutors had built from the first day of trial. Defense teams signaled further review and then returned to clients with timelines instead of promises. What remains after verdict is a set of questions trials can't answer because courts do not sentence dynamics, they sentence acts. The record recognizes coercion without letting it convert harm into necessity. It registers love as motive without allowing it to become justification. It acknowledges fear while insisting that phones and doors and stairwells still offer choices. In this courtroom, minutes carried more weight than motives because minutes could be proved. That is the lesson this chapter leaves. When people tell stories about nights like this, the law listens, but the law rules for the clock. This story isn't about the perfect and the monstrous. It's about how control masquerades as care and how secrets multiply risk. Love does not justify violence. Violence does not fix control. Either system breaks people, and sometimes breaks lives beyond repair. We have separated facts from versions and avoided conclusions where there is no direct proof. If you ever have information about similar cases, even a small detail, report it to law enforcement or anonymous hotlines. Accuracy is the only path to justice.